There is a photograph of Princess Marina taken in the summer of 1934, just months before her wedding. She looks like someone who has never known real suffering. And in that moment, she hadn't. What followed was a life that began like a fairy tale, and then quietly, patiently became something else entirely. But this story is not really about Marina. It is about what she left behind. 3 children, 3 completely different lives, and in each one a thread of loss that seems almost too deliberate to be coincidence. By the time you finish watching this, you will understand why people who study the Kent family closely tend to go quiet when they reach the part about the children, the woman who built the foundation. To understand what happened to Marina's 3 children, you first have to understand what kind of world she built for them, and what kind of world she lost before they were old enough to understand it themselves. Marina was born on December 13, 1906 in Athens, the youngest daughter of Prince Nicholas of Greece and Denmark and Grand Duchess Elena Vladimirovna of Russia. She grew up in a world of inherited titles and shifting borders. A world where royal families moved between countries the way other people moved between rooms. Her mother was the granddaughter of Tsar Alexander II. Her grandmother on her father's side was Queen Olga of Greece. For the first 11 years of her life, Marina lived in the warmth of the Greek royal household at Tatoi Palace outside Athens. She and her 2 older sisters, Olga and Elizabeth, were raised with devotion and routine, encouraged to be devout by their grandmother, guided closely by their parents. It was, by all accounts, a genuinely happy childhood. Not the kind of happiness that gets performed in official portraits, but the real ordinary kind. Children playing in a garden, summer visits to extended family across Europe. A mother who was present and attentive. And then when Marina was 11, it ended. The Greek monarchy was overthrown, and the family was forced into exile. They settled in Paris, living modestly, renting rooms in a city full of other displaced aristocrats, who had once owned palaces, and now compared notes on how to manage with very little. Marina learned to sew her own clothes. She became fluent in French and English and German. She developed the kind of composure that only comes from being forced very young to adjust to loss. By the time she arrived in London in the early 1930s, Marina was already something different from the average royal woman. She had an eye for art, a talent for fashion, a genuine intelligence, and a manner that was warm without being soft. The British press were almost immediately enchanted by her. She met Prince George, the Duke of Kent, the 4th son of King George V, in London in 1932. They were distant cousins, both descended from King Christian IX of Denmark. Their betrothal was announced in August 1934. The wedding at Westminster Abbey on November 29, 1934, was the first royal wedding to be broadcast on radio. Millions of people across Britain and the Commonwealth listened. Marina wore a dress of Xantine-inspired silver brocade, a tiara of diamonds and sapphires, and carried herself with the kind of controlled elegance that made her the most photographed woman in England for the next several years. She and George made, by all accounts, an extraordinary couple. Their London home in Belgrave Square became a gathering place for writers, artists, musicians, and politicians. George was charming and restless, a man of complicated appetites, who had spent much of his 20s in a kind of turbulent personal wilderness, drug use, relationships with men and women that the palace did their best to manage quietly, a general reputation for being ungovernable. Marina, it seemed, steadied him, or at least she gave him something worth being steady for. Their first child, Edward, was born on October 9, 1935. Princess Alexandra arrived on Christmas Day, 1936. And then in July 1942, came Prince Michael, born just 7 weeks before his father would fly out of a Scottish air base and never come back. Marina had built a world for her children. What happened to it next is what this story is really about. Because what happened on August 25, 1942, was not just a personal tragedy. It was the event that shaped everything, every marriage, every struggle, every quiet grief that came after. And it started with something that to this day has never been fully explained. The crash at Eagles Rock. The morning of August 25, 1942, was foggy along the east coast of Scotland. A short Sunderland flying boat, serial number W4026 belonging to 228 Squadron of the Royal Air Force's Coastal Command, lifted off from RAF in Borden on the Cromarty FTH at just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Its destination was Iceland, where Prince George, Duke of Kent, was scheduled to make a morale-boosting visit to RAF stations. The flight should have taken 7 hours. It lasted 32 minutes. The aircraft had been heavily loaded, 2,550 gallons of fuel in its wings. The planned route was simple. Follow the coastline north to Duncan's Behead, then turn northwest toward Iceland. The captain, Flight Lieutenant Frank Goyen, was considered one of the most capable Sunderland pilots in the RAF. His co-pilot, Wing Commander Thomas Mosley, was a navigation specialist with over 1,400 flying hours. The crew had been hand-picked. For reasons that have never been satisfactorily explained, the aircraft drifted off course. It turned inland instead of continuing up the coast. And then, for reasons that are equally mysterious, it descended to somewhere around 650 feet, far too low to clear the rising granite hills of Cawes. It flew straight into Eagle's Rock, a remote hillside near Dund. The fuel tanks exploded on impact. 14 of the 15 men on board were killed instantly. Prince George was 39 years old. His youngest child, Michael, was 7 weeks old. His daughter, Alexandra, was 5. His son, Edward, the new Duke of Kent, from the moment his father died, was 6. The sole survivor was the rear gunner, Flight Sergeant Andrew Jack, who was thrown clear of the wreckage. A local girl found him in the heather the following day, injured but alive. He recovered, served in the RAF until 1964, and for the rest of his life. He died in 1978, refused to speak publicly about what had happened on that flight. The official inquiry concluded it was navigational error. The captain had changed the flight plan for reasons unknown, descended through cloud without confirming he was over water, and struck rising ground. The inquiry placed the responsibility squarely on the late Flight Lieutenant Goyen, who could not, of course, respond. The documents relating to the inquiry have since vanished, not misplaced, not archived in the wrong location. Vanished. Over the decades, the theories accumulated. Some claimed that Prince George himself had been at the controls at the time of the crash. He held a pilot's license, and that Jack had moved the body before the inquiry team arrived. Others suggested the aircraft was not actually heading to Iceland at all, but to neutral Sweden on a secret diplomatic mission. There were claims of a briefcase handcuffed to the Duke's wrist containing foreign currency of no use in Iceland. There were claims difficult to fully verify that a top-secret Nazi report received by German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop in December 1942 described the Duke as sympathetic to peace negotiations with Germany, and that he had been deliberately removed. One book published in 2001 went so far as to claim that Rudolf Hess, Germany's deputy Führer, who had made his own strange solo flight to Scotland the previous year, had secretly been on board. None of these theories have been proven. The more serious researchers tend to dismiss the most dramatic versions, but the absence of documentation combined with the circumstances of the crash, the experienced crew, the clear weather reported at the inquiry, the inexplicable deviation from course, the impossibly low altitude has kept the questions alive for more than 80 years. What is not a theory is the effect of the crash on the 3 children left behind. Edward was 6, Alexandra was 5. Michael was 7 weeks old, and would never know his father at all. Marina had given birth to Michael on July 4, 1942. 6 weeks later, she was a widow. There were no financial provisions for a royal duke's widow at the time. The civil list payments simply stopped upon George's death, leaving Marina and the children without income. King George V, 6th, and Queen Mary stepped in to help. Marina trained as a nurse for 3 months under the name Sister K, joined the Civil Nurse Reserve and kept going. She always kept going. But something fundamental had been removed from the Kent family. The father who might have guided these children, softened certain edges, intervened at certain moments. He was not there. And one by one the children found their own ways of living inside that absence. Edward was the eldest, the one who inherited the title at 6 years old, who grew up under the shadow of a father he barely remembered, and who would go on to choose a wife that his formidable mother, at first at least, refused to accept. And the story of that marriage is darker and more painful than most people realize. Edward, the Duke who almost lost everything. Edward George Nicholas Paul Patrick, the second Duke of Kent from the age of 6, grew up as the eldest, the heir, the one on whom the greatest weight of expectation rested. He was educated at Eton, and then at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. Following the path expected of him, he joined the army, served with the Royal Scots Greys, and by the mid-1950s was stationed at Catterick in Yorkshire. It was there in 1957 at a private gathering that he met Catherine Worley. Catherine was 24. She was the only daughter of Sir William Worsley, 4th Baronet, a Yorkshire landowner and former president of the Marylebone Cricket Club. Her mother, Joyce Brunner, was from a family of chemical industrialists. Catherine had grown up at Hovingham Hall, a substantial estate in North Yorkshire, in a household that was wealthy and upper class, but emphatically not royal. She had trained briefly as a music teacher, studied music and French at a finishing school in Oxford, and was considered, in the words of her biographer Mary Reddell, someone who had been steered toward a grand marriage by a mother who wanted one for her. Edward fell for Catherine quickly. She was kind, musical, and gentle in a way that felt rare. He would often travel to Hovingham by back roads or on a local bus, arriving quietly trying to avoid the press. Their relationship became more widely known in 1960 after photographs appeared of them together at a formal ball. Then came the complication that Marina represented. Princess Marina reportedly disapproved of the match. She declined to give her blessing twice. The reasons given varied in different accounts. Catherine was not royal. She had no title. She was the first woman without a title to marry a royal duke in more than 100 years. Marina had been the last foreign princess to marry into the British royal family, and was known in certain circles to be proud of that distinction. Her daughter-in-law, Catherine's biographer noted, lived for years in the shadow of a formidable mother-in-law who made her presence felt. Marina eventually relented. The engagement was announced in March 1961. And on June 8 of that year, Edward and Catherine were married at York Minster, the first royal marriage to take place there in 633 years. Princess Anne was one of the bridesmaids. The guest list included Noel Coward and Douglas Fairbanks Jr., as well as representatives of royal families from across Europe. Catherine's dress, designed by John Kavanagh, used 273 yards of white silk gauze with a commanding train and a high neckline. She wore the Kent diamond and pearl fringe tiara. It looked like a fairy tale. It was not. The couple welcomed 3 children over the following years. George, Earl of St. Andrews, born in 1962. Lady Helen Taylor, born in 1964, and Lord Nicholas Windsor, born in 1970. But underneath the official portrait of a functioning royal marriage, something else was developing. Catherine found royal life crushing. She had entered it without fully understanding what it demanded. The scrutiny, the protocol, the relentless requirement to appear at engagements, the isolation of a life structured entirely by duty, all of it pressed down on her in ways she was not equipped to manage. By the mid-1970s, the marriage was in serious difficulty. In 1976, Edward sought the counsel of Michael Munn, the Dean of Windsor, who was aware both of Catherine's profound inner struggles and of the strain that those struggles were placing on the marriage. The divorce of Princess Margaret from Lord Snowdon was fresh in the minds of the royal family, and Edward resolved that his marriage would survive. What followed, according to Catherine's biographer, was less a true reconciliation than a shared commitment to endurance. In 1975, Catherine had been forced to end a pregnancy early due to exposure to German measles. Then, on October 4, 1977, she gave birth to a third son who was born still. She named him Patrick. In a later interview, she spoke about the experience with an openness that was unusual for a member of the royal family, describing it as having a devastating effect on her, something from which she could not simply recover. She spoke of acute depression, of feeling as though she had caved in entirely. She was right to describe it that way. What followed were years of serious mental health struggles during which she received what her biographer described as an amount of medication that many later regarded as excessive. In 1978, Catherine was hospitalized for several weeks with what was described at the time as nervous strain. She kept attending engagements. She handed out the trophies at Wimbledon year after year, a familiar and gracious presence in the royal box known for her warmth. But she was by many accounts during this period a woman managing a private catastrophe with the resources of a public role. In 1994, she converted to Catholicism, making her one of the very few members of the British royal family to do so since the Act of Settlement of 1701. She spoke plainly about what drew her. She said she had always needed clear guidelines, had always needed to know what was expected of her, and that she found that in the structure of the Catholic Church. Then in 1996, she did something remarkable. She quietly withdrew from royal duties and took a job. Not a ceremonial role, not a patronage, not a ribbon-cutting position. She became a music teacher at Onspec Primary School in Hull, one of the most economically deprived areas in England. She was known to her pupils simply as Mrs. Kent. She spent 13 years there and later described those years as the most wonderful of her life. She co-founded a charity called Future Talent in 2004 to support musically gifted children from disadvantaged backgrounds. She died on September 4, 2025, at the age of 92, at Wren House in Kensington Palace. Edward, now 89, is still alive at the time of this video, still carrying out occasional royal duties. He has outlived his wife and spent the last several decades as one of the quieter, more steadfast members of the royal family. The 6-year-old boy who inherited his father's title, and spent the rest of his life trying to be equal to it. But as painful as Edward's life had been, the childhood loss, the difficult marriage, the weight of responsibility that came without being asked for, what happened with his younger sister, Alexandra, carried a different kind of ache, because Alexandra seemed for a long time to be the one who had navigated her inheritance most gracefully. And then her own daughter stepped forward and made sure the world knew that the Kent family's quiet suffering was not quite finished. Alexandra, the brightest star and the daughter who broke the silence. Princess Alexandra was born on Christmas Day 1936 at the family's London home in Belgrave Square. She was the second child and only daughter of George and Marina, and she arrived with a particular kind of brightness about her. Even as a small child, she was described by those who knew the family as warm and direct in a way that felt more natural than her elder brother's careful reserve. She was 5 years old when her father died, old enough to register the loss, young enough to have spent most of her life without a clear memory of him. During the war years, she lived for a time with her grandmother, Queen Mary, at Badminton, the same grandmother who had once treated the young Marina and her sisters as her own children when they visited London as girls. There was something circular about that, something poignant, a grandmother providing the stability that war and death had temporarily removed. Alexandra grew up to be what the press described as the most approachable member of the royal family. She was the first British princess to attend an ordinary school, enrolling at Heathfield School near Ascot in 1947 when she was 11. She later studied music and French in Paris. She began undertaking royal engagements in her late teens, and by the early 1960s was representing the Queen independently across the Commonwealth, traveling to Australia and elsewhere with a warmth that seemed entirely genuine. She fell in love with Angus Ogilvy, a businessman 8 years her senior from a noble Scottish family with close ties to the Windsor. The engagement was announced in November 1962, and on April 24, 1963, they were married at Westminster Abbey. An estimated 200 million people watched the ceremony on television. Angus turned down the Queen's offer of an earldom upon marriage, which meant that their children, James, born in 1964, and Marina, born in 1966, named after her grandmother, would carry no royal titles. For much of the next 2 decades, Alexandra and Angus seemed to be the quieter, steadier branch of the Kent family. They lived at Thatched House Lodge in Richmond Park, a Crown property on a long lease. Alexandra carried out hundreds of royal engagements, became patron or president of over 100 organizations, and was consistently one of the most popular members of the extended royal family, known for her ability to connect with people in a way that felt unscripted. But Angus' career brought its own difficulties. In the 1970s, he became caught up in what became known as the Lonhro affair, a business scandal involving allegations that the company had broken sanctions against Rhodesia. Angus, a director of the company, was described in a Department of Trade report as having been negligent. He was not found to have acted deliberately or corruptly, and he resigned from 16 of his directorships, including Lonhro. He was ultimately cleared of wrongdoing, but the shadow of the affair lingered. He shifted away from the corporate world and spent much of his later life devoted to charity work, serving as president of the Imperial Cancer Research Fund, chairman of Youth Clubs UK, and a trustee of a number of organisations associated with the Prince's Trust. He died on December 26, 2004 after several months in hospital with complications from cancer. Alexandra outlived him. She is still alive at the time of this video at 88, quietly present at royal occasions, maintaining the warmth that has always defined her public role. But in 1989, something happened that made it impossible for the Kent family, and for Alexandra in particular, to remain simply a symbol of royal grace. Her daughter, Marina Ogilvy, announced that she was pregnant. Marina was 23. The father was Paul Mote, a freelance photographer she had been in a relationship with for some time. They were not married. This in isolation would hardly have been world-ending news. But what turned the story from a private family matter into something altogether messier was what Marina did next. She gave a detailed interview to a tabloid newspaper. In that interview, she described the reaction of her parents that they had pressured her either to marry quickly, in what was characterized as a rushed arrangement, or to end the pregnancy. She also said that her trust fund and monthly allowance had been cut off, and that she had written directly to Queen Elizabeth II addressing her as Dear Cousin Leet, asking the Queen to intervene on her behalf. Marina's parents denied the account. They said they loved their daughter, that she was welcome at home at any time, and that the depiction of their response was inaccurate. Marina and Paul Mote married on February 2, 1990. They had 2 children, Zanuska and Christian. The marriage ended in divorce in 1997. What the episode made visible was something that the smooth exterior of Alexandra's life had not shown clearly. The loss of her father at 5, the years of navigating royal duty without a clear template, the pressure to maintain appearances in all circumstances, and then a daughter who found her own way of insisting that appearances were not enough. Marina Ogilvy, named for the grandmother, who had never fully escaped grief herself, had made the private public in a way that the Kent family's tradition of dignified restraint had not prepared anyone for. But of all 3 of Marina's children, it is the youngest. The one born just 7 weeks before his father's death, the one who never knew his father at all, whose story may be the most complicated. Because Prince Michael grew up to make a marriage that cost him something significant, and to build a public life that has brought him more controversy than either of his siblings ever faced. Michael, the one who never knew his father. Prince Michael of Kent was born on July 4, 1942 at Coppens, the family's country house in Buckinghamshire. He was the 3rd and youngest child of George and Marina. His father was dead before Michael was 2 months old. This is not a small thing. To grow up in a family shaped by a loss that preceded your own memory is to inhabit a grief that belongs to everyone else, and that you have to take on faith. Michael grew up knowing his father only through photographs, through stories from his mother and siblings, through the weight of a title Duke of Kent that his older brother carried, and that defined the family's standing in the world. He had, by all accounts, a closer relationship with his mother than either of his siblings. Marina was reported to have pampered her youngest somewhat, perhaps out of the awareness of what he had missed, perhaps out of her own need to hold on to something of the husband she had barely had time to mourn. Michael was educated at Eton, and then at Sandhurst, following the path set by his brother. He served in the British Army for a number of years, reaching the rank of major before leaving in 1981. Unlike Edward and Alexandra, he has never received a parliamentary annuity, or any allowance from the privy purse. He is not in the formal sense a working royal. He has funded his life through private consultancy work and commercial activities, and the arrangement has brought its own complications over the years. But the story that defines Michael's life, the one that created the most immediate crisis and the most lasting consequences, is his marriage. In the early 1970s, Michael encountered a woman named Baroness Marie Christine Vonitz at the home of a mutual acquaintance in London. She was Austrian-Hungarian by background. Born in January 1945 in what was then the German-occupied Sudetenland, now part of the Czech Republic, she was striking, tall, fluent in multiple languages, and possessed of the kind of unabashedly aristocratic confidence that was either deeply charming or deeply alienating, depending on whom you asked. At the time of their first meeting, Marie Christine was married to Thomas Trubridge, an English banker. Their marriage had already been deteriorating for some time. They separated in 1973 and formally divorced in 1977. The marriage was annulled by the Catholic Church in May 1978. 1 month after the annulment, on June 30, 1978, Michael and Marie Christine were married in a civil ceremony at the City Hall in Vienna. There was no church wedding. The Catholic Church had refused to grant the dispensation required for a mixed religion ceremony, largely because Marie Christine had publicly stated that any children would be raised Anglican. Pope Paul V declined. It was not until 1983, after Pope John Paul II granted special permission, that the couple received a Catholic blessing of their marriage at Archbishop's House in London. The complications went beyond the religious. Under the Act of Settlement of 1701, no member of the royal family could marry a Roman Catholic without forfeiting their place in the line of succession. Michael was at the time of his marriage 15th in line to the throne. On the day he married Marie Christine, he lost that position. He was eventually reinstated when the Succession to the Crown Act of 2013 came into force in 2015, by which time the line had expanded considerably, and he was much further down it. But the principle had been clear at the time. The marriage cost him something that could not be recovered by negotiation. The couple settled at Kensington Palace in an apartment that had belonged to Marina, furnished with the contents of his mother's home. They had 2 children, Lord Frederick Windsor, born in 1979, and Lady Gabriella Windsor, born in 1981. Lady Gabriella's own life would later carry its own grief. She married Thomas Kingston in 2019, in a celebrated wedding. Kingston died unexpectedly in February 2024 at the age of 45, leaving Gabriella a widow at 42, echoing in a way that no one in the family could have failed to feel the image of her grandmother. Marina left a widow with 3 small children by a death that came without warning. Michael himself has not been without controversy. His commercial work has attracted criticism over the years, including scrutiny of his consultancy activities in Russia, which he pursued for many years, and which brought pointed public criticism, particularly in the context of Russia's actions in Ukraine. He has spoken publicly about his deep personal connection to Russia. His great-grandmother was Grand Duchess Elena Vladimirovna of Russia, and through her he has bloodline ties to the Romanovs. When the remains of Tsar Nicholas II and his family were recovered and identified in the early 1990s, Michael provided a DNA sample that was used in the process. He attended the burial of the Tsar's family in St. Petersburg in 1998. It is a life assembled from fragments. The father he never knew, the mother he lost when he was 25, the titles and traditions he inherited without choosing them, and the choices he made that set him apart from his siblings in ways that occasionally created real friction with the palace. Marie Christine, too, has been one of the more contentious figures at the edge of the royal family for decades. She has been the subject of allegations of inappropriate comments on several occasions. A book she published in 1986 faced plagiarism allegations that were settled out of court. She has written extensively about European royal history, conducted lecture tours, and maintained a public profile that is difficult to reduce to a simple description. Those who have encountered her personally often describe someone brilliant, opinionated, and deeply serious about her interests. Those who have encountered her in print or in headlines have sometimes found something more combative. But the central fact of Michael's story remains the marriage itself. The Catholic question, the loss of succession rights, the need to travel to Vienna for a civil ceremony because no provision existed in England for what they were trying to do. It was, in its own way, a declaration of independence from the constraints of the family he had been born into, an assertion that the life he wanted mattered more than the position he stood to lose. Marina, his mother, died on August 27, 1968 of a brain tumor at Kensington Palace. She was 61. Michael was 25. Edward was 32. Alexandra was 31. Marina had outlived her husband by 26 years, and watched all three of her children reach adulthood. She had served the crown with absolute fidelity, representing the Queen at independence celebrations in Ghana in 1957, in Botswana, and Lesotho in 1966, undertaking a major tour of Australia in 1964, serving as Chancellor of the University of Kent, presiding over Wimbledon as President of the All England Club for 26 years. She had dressed beautifully and spoken carefully, and carried herself with the composure that had been trained into her from childhood by exile and loss. Her estate at the time of her death was valued at just over $76,000. For a woman whose life had been so outwardly grand, it was a modest sum, a reflection of the fact that the glamour had always been borrowed from position rather than from actual wealth. She was buried in the royal burial ground at Frogmore. On the day before her funeral, her husband's body was moved there from St. George's Chapel, Windsor, so that they could rest together 26 years after the crash at Eagles Rock had separated them. 3 children, 3 different inheritances of the same loss, and above all of it, the difficult marriage, the business scandal, the public dispute, the forfeited title. There is the original absence. A father who died at 39 when the youngest of his children was 7 weeks old, and a mother who spent the rest of her life keeping everything upright on her own, what the children carried. It would be easy, looking at the 3 Kent children from the outside, to see 3 relatively privileged lives shadowed by the ordinary complications of public existence. A duke with a troubled marriage, a princess whose daughter caused a tabloid scandal, a prince who fell in love with the wrong woman by the crown's definition. But there is another way of seeing it. Edward was 6 when his father died and became a duke. He spent his entire adult life trying to live up to a title that arrived before he was old enough to understand it. He chose a wife he loved, who was not built for the life the title required, and he chose to stay, not because the choice was easy, but because leaving was something he had decided quietly he would not do. He watched his wife struggle. He stayed. And when she chose in her 60s to set aside the role of Duchess entirely, and become a music teacher in Hull, he let her. Catherine died at 92 on her own terms, having spent her last decades doing the thing she had always wanted to do. Alexandra navigated the loss of her father at 5 and built a public life of genuine service, warmth, and consistency. She was one of the most loved members of the extended royal family for decades. When her daughter Marina broke the family's tradition of private suffering by speaking openly about a painful dispute, Alexandra endured it with the same composure she had maintained through everything. The composure was real. So was the cost of maintaining it. Michael grew up without a father in a family still marked by that absence, and made the choice to marry the woman he loved even when it meant losing his place in the succession. He has lived outside the formal structure of the working royal family. No official allowance, no regular ceremonial duties, funding his own life through his own work, in a position that is neither fully inside nor fully outside the institution he was born into. All 3 of them carry in different forms the same original event. A plane that turned inland when it should have followed the coast. A hillside in Cos on a foggy August afternoon. 14 deaths in 32 minutes. Prince George, Duke of Kent, was 39 years old. His oldest child was 6. His youngest was 7 weeks. The documents from the inquiry into his death no longer exist. The question of what really happened on that flight remains more than 80 years later unanswered. Marina of Greece and Denmark came from a family of royal exiles who had learned to keep going. She kept going for 26 years after the crash. She raised 3 children in circumstances that the palace had not actually made provision for. She worked. She represented the crown with dignity in places as far apart as Ghana and Australia. She appeared at Wimbledon every summer. She died in 1968 at Kensington Palace at 11:40 in the morning of a brain tumor in the same building where she had lived since 1955. She was 61, the same age at which a great many people are just beginning to feel that life has opened up a little. Her children, Edward, Alexandra, Michael, had each by then found the life that circumstances and choice had produced for them. None of those lives were simple. None of them were unmarked by the loss that had come before they were old enough to choose anything for themselves. In the end, this is not a story about tragedy in the dramatic sense. No single event defines it after the crash at Eagles Rock. It is a quieter kind of story about what it costs to carry a loss you did not ask for in a role that requires you to carry it gracefully over the course of an entire life. About what gets passed down through families, through bloodlines and buildings and the name on a tiara. About 3 children who grew up inside an absence and found their own ways of being present. Marina named her youngest daughter Marina. Alexandra named her daughter Marina. The name traveled forward through the family, carrying with it the memory of the woman who had brought it from Greece to England in 1934, who had worn it with such composure, and who had been gone since 1968. Some things persist. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.